Hey, what's up, everybody? It's Brian Jester, co-founder here at Occupy Fantasy, and we're back with some UFC DFS picks and lineup advice for both FanDuel and DraftKings for UFC 254 between Khabib and GAETHJE on Fight Island. In this video, we're going to use the tools at OccupyFantasy.com to talk about some top plays, some lineup strategies for FanDuel and DraftKings, both low risk and high risk contests. We're going to talk about some projected ownership, and then, of course, just some general lineup tips to help get you to the top of those leaderboards. Before we get started, go ahead and click that subscribe button below to get access to all of our videos here on YouTube as soon as they're released. Hit us with one of those thumbs ups. Any questions you have about this slate, let us know. Hop in the comments. Also want to hear who you think the highest scoring underdog will be on the slate. Let us know in the comments section below. Winner will receive a free copy of our Ultimate Guide, our 19-chapter DFS ebook. So comment below. We're going live on Twitch. If you get a chance to watch this live before we go live on Twitch, 10 p.m. Eastern Friday night, you can always catch the replay where we do a live Q&A, twitch.tv/Occupy Fantasy. We're doing that Friday evening because the slate does start super early on Saturday, 10:30, 11 a.m. Eastern time. All right, so let's jump into it. Let's look at some top plays, talk about the main event, some underdogs, projected ownership, all that good stuff. So let's look at, pull up my notes here, the main event. Sort by fight here. Khabib 28-0 versus Justin Gaethje. Khabib a pretty big, sizable favorite in this matchup, unsurprisingly, as he's 28-0, undefeated. And let's pull up the Occupy model here. Ranks every fighter on the slate, FanDuel and DraftKings. By our proprietary metric, the OF index, basically how I like to explain it is the probability a fighter will win times the probability that he or she will end up in the optimal lineup. So kind of a winning percentage times upside metric is the best way to think about it. And if we look at, let's sort by price here, or sort by FanDuel price, Khabib minus 335. Now this fight opens as Khabib is a much smaller favorite. And you got to figure the lines were opened a while ago as this fight is heavily anticipated. Over that time, Khabib has moved up to a minus 335 favorite, was in the mid 200s at one point. I guess people are starting to wise up a little bit. Now, a couple things here. Khabib, if you watch the weigh-ins, lots of sketchy action on the scales. He looked visibly drained, looked very relieved he made weight. You got to remember, this is his first fight without his father. Lots of narratives at play here. But again, we look at the money lines. Betting markets don't seem to think that has any impact. No sharp money coming the other way just yet. We'll check overnight to see if anything happens in the morning. But from a fighting standpoint, Khabib is in a great spot here. Now, Gaethje is I think, an All-American wrestler or state champion wrestler, but he's never really been tested on the ground in the UFC, and he's definitely never seen the likes of Khabib's ground game. So that'll be the big test here. Can he stay on his feet? And if he gets put on his back, how does he survive? What does he do? Because most people don't survive that from Khabib. Now, if we're looking at this from a DFS level, Khabib has just crushed in basically every outing on both FanDuel and DraftKings, 100-plus points, every single win. And that looks to be the same here because he's going to get takedowns and advances, he's going to get submission attempts, and if he gets the ground and pound going, adds up to significant strikes and a decent chance to end this one early, as you see with a 48% knockout chance in our model. Knockout chance, finish percent, submission, TKO, whatever it may be. Now, Gaethje, on the other hand, he's also very likely to end up in the optimal lineup. Unlikely he wins a decision here. It would have to keep standing on the feet and completely outstrike Khabib, which would give him a pretty high score, especially on DraftKings where he's 7K. FanDuel, it's a little tougher, but again, if he wins, it probably comes from KO, which he's done to most every other opponent. And in that case, he's going to be a low-owned, expensive fighter on FanDuel because if we look here, we expect him to be 6 to 10% owned on FanDuel just because he's $18 and a plus 265 underdog. In general, a terrible value, but you got to think about the upside for tournaments. Gaethje has massive upside at low ownership. Even if he's unlikely to win, if he does win, should be pretty heavy scoring. So you need exposure to this fight. Long story short, DraftKings especially, probably near 100% exposure. FanDuel, probably near 100% exposure too. If you're making just a couple lineups, get one of these fighters into your lineup. Our model prefers Khabib. The betting markets prefer Khabib. Ownership obviously prefers Khabib as we see him the highest projected owned fighter on both sites. All right, Now, the slate doesn't look that great overall, but we always look to some of the newcomers to see if they can provide some hidden upside. Now, we have 5 UFC noobs on the slate, and let's talk about them really quickly. We have Miranda. Let's go to the DraftKings actually and talk about them this way, just so we can see. We have Miranda Maverick, who's making her debut. She likely has the advantage in all areas in this fight. She's a massive favorite, but she's still relatively inexperienced, so anything could happen here. And she is facing the submission specialist in Jojua, so not safe by any means, especially at her price tag of 9,300. The next one is Shavkot Rakhmatov, who is 12-0, mostly questionable competition, but he's finished all 12 of his fights, and he's actually submitted current UFC, if he played last week's slate, Jung Yeon Park, who controversial DFS scoring, I guess, did beat John Phillips, but Rakhmonov submitted him a few years ago, so he at least fought one UFC opponent. And as we'll talk about here in a second, the money line's actually moved in his favor, so something to keep in mind. All right, the other UFC newcomer, an underdog against veteran Lauren Murphy, is Shakirova. Similar area of the world as Rakhmonov. And, I mean, if you think Rakhmonov's fought questionable competition, Shakirova's fought even less quality competition. And she's taking this fight on short notice, just 9 days. She said in her press conference the other day that she was planning on fighting in December. But I guess when UFC calls, you don't turn it down. And she was, relatively unprepared for this fight. So at a disadvantage at every level, facing questionable competition throughout her career. I'm surprised she's not a much bigger underdog here. Murphy's, I think, a relative value both in the betting markets and in DFS against Shakirova, who's just put in a really tough spot here. And then we have a final fight between 2 newcomers. Now, Philip Halls, let's actually sort by fight here. They put this one on the main card, so Dana White must think that there's potential for fireworks or at least a good fight here between Halls and Malkoun. Halls on the Contender Series twice, heavy KO potential. In fact, has the highest round 1 knockout probability on the entire slate. So, and you're paying for that with his $9,100 price tag. Heavy KO potential. A little questionable in his technique, but you can't argue with the guy's power. And then he's facing Jacob Malkoun out of Australia or New Zealand. I think it's New Zealand. I could be wrong here. But somewhere down under, South Pacific. And Malkoun only has 4 MMA fights to his name. He's 4-0. But he's fought professionally boxing as well, 3-0 there. He won an Asian grappling competition. So the dude's well-rounded, and he's literally never lost in anything he's done. So he's definitely a live dog here. Halls has proven to be hittable. He's KO or bust. So Malkoun is an underdog, could certainly get there, 7,100. And as we look here in a second, not a ton of upside on this slate, so a low-scoring underdog. Even if Malkoun doesn't get a finish, even if he scores a decent decision, could end up in the optimal lineup at 7,100. So definitely someone to keep in mind as you're looking for underdogs to fill out, especially your tournament lineups. So speaking of this lack of high scoring potential on the slate, there's some slates we look at, it's like, wow, like every single fight could end in a finish. And we'll see fighters in our Occupy model, just tons of fighters rank highly. This week, this slate, if we sort by OF index, normally we look at like 90 to 100 as an elite number. Just 2 fighters above 100 for the whole slate on a slate of 24 fighters. That tells us that generally not much upside here, and that can kind of dictate our strategy a bit, especially in high-risk contests. Now, as I say this, there will be like 8 finishes probably, and it'll be one of the highest scoring slates. But based on everything we look at before the slate starts, it shouldn't be that high scoring. So we'll see if the fighting gets tricky or not. So as a result, with the lack of upside, we see a condensed ownership on Khabib. There's some other fighters with comparable money lines, but he ends up with the highest ownership as a result because of his high scoring potential compared to everyone else around him. If there are a bunch of high volume, high knockout potential, high finish potential fighters around him, Khabib might not get this high, but because there isn't, we see him as by far the highest owned fighter. Now, this projected ownership, we do the FanDuel projected ownership. The DraftKings projected ownership comes from our partnership with MMA DFS.com. Go check out their content over there for fighter breakdowns. And the other thing to think about, if this is a truly low-scoring slate, is that even if some of these favorites win, we're thinking, let's sort here by money line. So we're looking at Maverick, Jung, uh, blew that one. Ankalaev, Halls. Like, if there aren't finishes early and it goes to decision, a lot of these fights could bust. Lauren Murphy, Volkov, like all these fights literally could bust from a DFS perspective. So what that means is, if there are underdogs that win, they can outscore some of these favorites. So what does that mean? That means we can leave more salary on the table in our high-risk lineups, especially on DraftKings, to help get us there in really large contests. So while most people, if we just sort by salary, right? And you could play Philip Halls, who has a ton of knockout potential, or you could play, I don't know, Walt Harris, who's an underdog. Almost everyone's going to play Halls in that scenario. But if Harris wins and Halls wins, Harris could outscore him, or Wood, or any of these fighters down here could potentially outscore a lot of these fighters if all these fights go to decisions, as it could happen. So just something to keep in mind. Don't be afraid to leave salary on the table in your high-risk contest, especially on DraftKings. So some other ideas here to think about as you're building your lineups for FanDuel and DraftKings. If we sort by salary, as we have it here, we see ownership. Let's look at DraftKings in particular here. We see ownership cluster around Jung, who's facing Sam Alvey, has 50% knockout potential. Khabib, obviously. Philip Hall's knockout potential. And then Ankalaev at 39% with 50% projected knockout rate. And then everyone else around there gets lower owned as a result. So another idea is, instead of, Khabib's one of the best plays on the board for sure, but instead of playing these KO dependent fighters like Jung, like Halls, like Ankalaev, you could play some of these other fighters who have a less probability of getting there on a finish, but if they do finish, they're going to score higher than everyone around them. So that's Miranda Maverick, that's Joel Alvarez, that's Lauren Murphy. Like those three in particular, low owned, 19%, 24%, 18%. That's great leverage in high risk contests, whether it's satellites, leagues, whatever it may be. That's one way to think about it, because the 30 to 35, 30 to 40% owned fighters are no locks by any means, right? Khabib is the closest to a lock you'll get on this slate, but everyone else beyond that is not a lock. So tons of leverage potential. The other idea is, as we said, talked about underdogs, because there are going to be a couple popular underdogs. Three in mind that we have. If we sort by ownership, we see Rakhmatov, who technically opened the week as an underdog. 7,700 on DraftKings, $14 on FanDuel. The line has moved 54 cents in his favor. He's now the favorite for this fight. He's the favorite to win this fight. So as a result, as a $7,700 fighter, $14 on FanDuel, he's cheaper than his opponent, yet he's the favorite. So expect him to be pretty popular, especially in low-risk contests. Makes a ton of sense. And if we look at Nathaniel Wood, he has a ton of finish potential, a lot of finishes in his history. Just a 140 underdog. He should be pretty popular, 30% on DraftKings especially. FanDuel is only $13, so I guess there too. And then the other one that will probably see some ownership is Tuivasa, who, similar to Rakhmatov, opened the week as basically a coin flip fighter, 24-cent move in his favor. He's now the favorite in this fight, and he's cheaper than his opponent. So anytime we see a flip like that, the underdog always ends up pretty popular, especially in low-risk contests. So start there in your low-risk contests, play those money line flip fighters, and then fill in the rest. High-risk contests, they make for good fade opportunities just because their ownership is pumped up because of their likelihood to win. Doesn't mean they're likely to score really well in a win. Big difference. So speaking of low-risk contests, right? So get these underpriced underdogs. I put it in quotes because they're underpriced, but they're not really underdogs in your lineups. Get in some of these favorites that are really high money line. So Maverick, potentially Jung, Ankalaev. Those are the big three outside of Khabib. And then on DraftKings, you probably can stack the main event, because what it does, you got to think about low-risk contests from this perspective, right? You don't need to get first place. You just got to beat half the field. So what's a great way to guarantee a top half finish? Get at least 100-point fighter into your lineup, even if that means sacrificing a second spot. So if you play Khabib and GAETHJE together in low risk only, where 50-50s, double ups, head-to-heads, where whoever wins, you're getting 100 points in your lineup more than likely. Whereas if you play one or the other, if that one loses, you're not guaranteed any 100-point performances. So that's a big move in low-risk contests on DraftKings. FanDuel, obviously, with GAETHJE priced where he is. What the hell is GAETHJE here? At $18, right? That's not a great play. You don't want to stack the main event on FanDuel just because of his price. But at 7K on DraftKings, that opens up everything, allows you to fit in more favorites and underpriced underdogs. On FanDuel, if you're playing low risk, just lock in Khabib as your MVP. He's going to be the most popular main event, 28-0. Just get him in your MVP spot. High risk contest is where we can differentiate an MVP, because Khabib, while he's likely to score high, very unlikely he gets like 150 points, 175 points on FanDuel. He can do it. He might do it. But some of these other fighters with higher round 1 KO probabilities catch our eye a little bit more. So if you're playing tournaments on FanDuel, if you look at round 1 KO probabilities, these 3 fighters stick out. I'm just going to sort by KO percentage here so we see them. Philip Hall's, as we said earlier, highest round 1 KO probability on the slate. He makes sense as a FanDuel MVP. Talked about Ankalaev. He knocked out Kutalaba in like 20 seconds. It was questionable last fight, but Ankalaev is a beast too, and high round 1 KO probability. And Jung as well against Sam Alvey. These 3 guys at the top of the model as far as KO percentage goes are your best FanDuel MVP options at a little bit lower ownership than Khabib. So something to think about. DraftKings, as we talked about, leave salary on the table, play the lower owned fighters at the top of the salary range, and think about some of those underdogs who could score decently in their wins. So that'll do it for this video. Went a little bit longer than expected, but go ahead and watch it, take notes, and then tune in live 10 p.m. Eastern Friday night on Twitch, twitch.tv/Occupy Fantasy, where we do a live Q&A. We talk about our favorite bets, and then we talk about just more lineup ideas than we did here. We go in depth on some of the fighters. And if you miss it, you can always watch the replay too. That link's in the description below. The Occupy model is up, will be updated. Projected ownership will be modified up until the slate starts Saturday morning. OccupyFantasy.com. Links also in the description for that. Finally, go ahead and subscribe. Click that subscribe button. Get access to our latest videos when they're released. Throw us that thumbs up. And then again, comment with questions here if you can't make the Twitch. And also let us know who the highest scoring underdog will be on the entire slate. Comment below. Winner gets a free copy of our ultimate guide. So, Brian Jester, Occupy Fantasy. Appreciate everyone listening here. Good luck for UFC 254. And we'll talk to you soon.